A cruel thing was done to a child, but the cruelest part wasn't nature, it was what came after, in the name of science. In 1939, in a quiet building in Davenport, Iowa, 22 orphan children were chosen for a study. It was led by Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, and his graduate student, Mary Tudor. The research asked a simple question: could stuttering be created, not born? Could the weight of a label twist a voice into silence? The children were split into two groups. One group was praised and encouraged for how they spoke. The other, labeled stutterers, regardless of how fluently they talked, was given something else: disapproval, correction, repeated reminders that their speech was flawed, even when it wasn't. Some were told not to speak unless they could do so perfectly. Some were warned their words were broken. Their voices, once natural and free, became stiff, then quiet, then afraid. None of the children gave consent. They were orphans, alone. They believed the adults in white coats were there to help. But the help came with mirrors that reflected them as broken, and soon they began to believe it. Over weeks, some began to truly stutter. Others developed deep anxiety around speaking. Long after the study ended, some carried the effects into adulthood, echoes of shame and hesitation stitched into their daily lives. The research was never published. Too disturbing, too cruel. For decades, it remained buried in archives and whispered regrets. When the truth came to light in 2001, the world called it what it was: monstrous. The study earned its name not from its methods alone, but from its betrayal of trust, of innocence, of the fragile belief that care and harm are always separate things. It is remembered now as one of the darkest chapters in psychological research, a reminder that suffering doesn't always come with bruises. Sometimes it comes with a softly spoken sentence, a pen scratching a note, a child hesitating before they speak. Some wounds are not visible. Some voices learn to tremble long after the room is empty. They called it science, but in the end, it was a quiet dismantling of identity, a proof that a voice, once doubted, can unravel like thread in the wind. And somewhere, in the silence between words, that unraveling still lingers, a soft reminder that even kindness, when misused, can echo like a cage. A cage was built to study love, but what it captured was despair. In the 1970s, deep in a lab at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, psychologist Harry Harlow sought to understand the mechanics of affection. He had already become known for controversial work with baby rhesus monkeys, separating them from their mothers, replacing warmth with wire, measuring their grief with stopwatches and notes. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to explore the other side of love. What happens when it's taken away entirely? He called it the pit of despair, a small steel chamber shaped like an inverted pyramid, smooth, sided, narrow at the bottom, lightless, soundless, escape-proof. Into this box, he placed infant monkeys who had once known their mothers. One by one, they were left alone. Days passed, then weeks. At first, they screamed and scrambled, trying to climb the slick walls. But eventually, they stopped, curled into corners, motionless, silent. Harlow wrote that they sat as if they found their situation to be hopeless. He watched as the light inside them dimmed. Some remained inside for 10 weeks. When they were finally released, they were different, changed in ways that could not be undone. They no longer played. They no longer reached out. They stared blankly at other monkeys, as if they no longer recognized what connection was. Some starved themselves to death. Others, when forced to breed, attacked their own offspring. The damage wasn't just visible, it was permanent. The goal was to create a model of human depression, to turn grief into numbers, loneliness into charts. But what Harlow created instead was a mirror, not for science, but for cruelty. Even his colleagues recoiled. The name alone, Pit of Despair, was a kind of confession. He chose it deliberately, to shock, to wound, and it did. He believed the ends justified the means, that to understand suffering, it had to be manufactured, and so he built a box and placed hope inside it, and closed the lid. The haunting truth of the experiment was not in its findings, but in the silence of those who endured it, in the way a creature can be stripped of trust, stripped of itself, until even the instinct to try disappears. Some said it proved how deeply love matters. Others saw only how far science can stray when it forgets its soul. And somewhere in the dark corners of memory, a small, frightened body still waits at the bottom of a cage. No one was meant to see. A living echo of what happens when comfort is removed, and nothing comes to take its place. A paradise was built for mice, but what it revealed was the death of meaning. Between 1968 and 1972, ethologist John B.C. Calhoun constructed a perfect world inside a laboratory in Maryland, a 9-foot square enclosure, clean, safe, quiet, with unlimited food, clean water, nesting materials, and no predators. He called it Universe 25. Into it, he placed 4 pairs of healthy mice. The idea was simple. What happens to a population when every need is met? No hunger, no danger, no scarcity, just space and time to live. At first, they thrived. They ate, slept, bred. Their numbers multiplied, from a handful to hundreds. But after day 600, something changed. Crowding, though not physical, pressed in like fog. The mice began to withdraw. Mothers neglected their pups. Some attacked them. Social bonds fractured. Males stopped defending territory. Others became violent. A few, whom Calhoun called the beautiful ones, groomed themselves obsessively. They stopped mating. They stopped fighting. They stopped caring. They just existed. The colony began to decay, not from disease, not from lack, but from within. Reproduction halted. No new generations replaced the old. In the end, the population collapsed. Not with violence, but with silence. A quiet extinction inside a perfect world. Calhoun watched it all. He called it a behavioral sink, a collapse of social behavior, born not of struggle, but of abundance. The mice, he said, had died not from starvation of the body, but starvation of purpose. Even when conditions were eased, nothing changed. The mice had forgotten how to be mice. The damage could not be reversed. It lived in them, a memory of confusion passed down without words. Some saw it as a mirror, a warning about cities, about people packed tightly together, growing numb. Others argued against the comparison. Mice are not men, but the metaphor lingered. What happens when there is nothing left to fight for? When the world asks nothing of you and offers everything? In Universe 25, comfort became a curse. With every need fulfilled, the mice lost the will to do anything at all. It became a utopia without meaning, a paradise haunted by absence. And long after the last mouse died, the walls still stood, silent, clean, untouched, a monument to what is lost when connection fades, when roles dissolve, when identity blurs into routine. The last ones did not scream. They did not starve. They simply stopped, as if forgetting how to live was easier than remembering why they ever began. 3 men sat in a room. Each believed he was Jesus Christ, but only one of them was conducting the experiment. In the summer of 1959, psychologist Milton Rokeach brought them together inside Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan. Joseph, Leon, and Clyde, each diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, each convinced of their divine identity. Rokeach had a theory: delusions are fragile. Perhaps they could be broken with contradiction. Perhaps, if one messiah met another, something inside would give way. So, he placed them in the same ward, scheduled daily meetings, encouraged conversation. He told them they weren't alone in their belief and watched as confusion unfolded. At first, they argued. Each man dismissed the others as fakes, machines, or corpses possessed. Fists were raised, words clashed, but none relented. Rokeach escalated. He wrote them letters from imaginary figurewives, mothers, even God himself. He tried to bend their narratives, to shift belief with scripted doubt. But the men adapted, each constructed explanations to protect the fragile world inside their minds. One said the others were insane, another said they were dead and trapped in delusion. Their convictions, rather than crumbling, thickened like scar tissue. The experiment lasted 2 years, and slowly, the truth emerged not about them, but about him. Rokeach had not cured delusion. He had only surrounded it with mirrors. He had played God in a ward full of men who already believed they were divine, and somewhere between observation and manipulation, the ethics blurred. The men did not improve. If anything, they became more fractured, emotionally worn, humiliated, observed like puzzles rather than people. In the final pages of his report, Rokeach would later admit his failure not just scientific, but moral. "I really had no right," he wrote, "even in the name of science, to play God." But the harm had been done. Joseph eventually faded into silence. Leon died in the hospital. Clyde was moved elsewhere, his voice quieter than before. They were not healed, just exhausted. 3 broken minds, placed in a theater of contradiction, expected to tear each other down until only one version of truth remained. But delusion is not undone by confrontation. And belief, even false belief, can be a shelter too deeply lived in to abandon. There is a strange kind of cruelty in testing identity, especially when that identity is the only thing keeping someone from disappearing. And so, the room remains, in memory. 3 chairs, 3 voices. One question echoing endlessly against padded walls. What happens when the only truth someone knows is taken apart piece by piece, and nothing better is offered in return? A knife was handed to a student, not in war, not in crime, but in the quiet name of science. In 1924, at the University of Minnesota, a young psychology graduate named Landis wanted to map the human face. His question seemed simple. Do all people wear the same expression when feeling shock, fear, joy, or disgust? He believed the truth might live in the muscles in the creases and trembles beneath the skin. So, he gathered volunteers, mostly fellow students. He painted black lines across their cheeks and foreheads, careful to mark each twitch and angle, and then he began. He shocked them with electricity to capture pain, dropped frogs into their hands to catch disgust, flashed disturbing images and whispered provocations to evoke discomfort and shame, camera always waiting. Light always cold, and still, he wanted more. At the end of each session came the final test, a white rat, a long knife, a command: decapitate the animal, here and now. Most hesitated, some laughed nervous, unsure if it was a joke, but it wasn't, and slowly, painfully, many complied. Their hands shaking, their faces tight with horror, they did as they were told. Others refused. But even they were made to watch as Landis himself calmly performed the act, eyes blank, camera clicking as blood hit the floor. And what was learned? Nothing. No grand discovery, no unifying map of emotion. The photographs showed chaos faces twisted in unique and unpredictable ways. There was no universal signature of disgust, no single shape for fear. Only pain, only difference. What lingered instead was the cost. Students left the lab pale, trembling, some in tears. No warning had been given, no comfort afterward, just a clean room, a closed door, a silence that stretched long into the nights that followed. Landis never seemed to question what he'd done. The study became a footnote in textbooks, strange, grotesque, nearly forgotten. But for those who stood with the knife, who looked into a living thing's eyes and believed they had no choice, the memory stayed sharp. It became a portrait not of emotion, but of obedience. How quickly morality can bend when framed as curiosity. How easily a white coat becomes a symbol of power. And how science, when stripped of empathy, can look like cruelty dressed in reason. The lab is gone now. The rats are gone. The students have aged or passed on. But somewhere in the faded edges of an old photograph, a face remains twisted, wide-eyed, caught between choice and pressure. And beside it, just out of frame, a hand still holding the knife. A dream was built in warm water, where words might swim between species. In 1965, on the island of St. Thomas, a strange home was constructed, partly submerged, partly scientific. It was called the Dolphin House, funded by NASA, led by neuroscientist John C. Lilly, and watched by hopeful eyes, it held one quiet question. Could a dolphin learn to speak human language? Inside lived a young Atlantic bottlenose dolphin named Peter, and with him, a woman, Margaret Howe Lovett. She moved in, lived shoulder deep in salt water, day and night. She slept on a floating bed. She whispered words and shaped sounds with her lips. Peter listened, imitated, reached across a gap no species had ever crossed. For 6 months, they lived as something other than dolphin and human companions, suspended between hope and strangeness. As Peter matured, his behavior shifted. He formed deep attachments, sometimes distracting, sometimes difficult. Margaret, with quiet patience, found ways to guide those moments gently, protecting the fragile rhythm of their shared routine. Her care was constant, her bond with him undeniable. Meanwhile, beyond the Dolphin House, Lilly pursued another path. He began exploring altered states, introducing mind-expanding chemicals to the other dolphins in the lab. He believed such substances might help unlock a new channel of communication. The boundaries between science and speculation thinned. But the words never came. Peter made sounds, some close, some strange, but language the kind humans hoped for never truly arrived. The funding dried up. The Dolphin House was closed. The story ended, not in discovery, but in silence. Peter was relocated to a standard tank, no floating bed, no daily voice, no one to echo his rhythms. He stopped responding, stopped surfacing. One morning, they found him motionless at the bottom of the water, a creature that breathes by choice, choosing not to. Lilly would later say Peter died of grief. Margaret called it heartbreak. What began as a search for connection became a quiet elegy, a reminder that empathy, without understanding, can blur into harm. The dream was never malicious, but it was incomplete. And sometimes, love isn't enough to save a life from loneliness. The Dolphin House remains one of science's strangest chapters. A flooded home, a dolphin who almost spoke, a woman who listened, and a bond too complex to explain in words. In the end, all that was left was a ripple in the water, and a question: what do we owe the ones who trusted us to understand them, and couldn't leave when we failed? A strange question once led to a stranger kind of science. Can anyone truly tell the difference between sanity and madness? In the early 1970s, psychologist David Rosenhan decided to find out, not through theory, but by stepping quietly into the world of psychiatry itself. He gathered 7 other mentally healthy volunteers and sent them into psychiatric hospitals across the United States. Their instructions were simple. Pretend to hear just one thing, a voice saying the words empty, hollow, and thud. That was all. After that, they told only the truth about their lives, their past, their habits. They acted completely normal. And yet, each one was diagnosed with serious mental illness, usually schizophrenia, and admitted. Inside the hospitals, they dropped the act. They reported feeling fine. The voices had stopped, they said, but the diagnosis held. Everything they did, from taking notes, to pacing, to sitting quietly, was interpreted as a symptom. Their ordinary behavior became pathology. One nurse described a patient's journaling as writing behavior. Another noted that a pseudo-patient's kindness towards staff suggested a need for approval, a sign of deeper instability. They remained inside for days, sometimes weeks. The average stay was 19 days, the longest 52. Medications were offered, often without question. The volunteers pretended to swallow, then quietly disposed of the pills. At no point were they recognized for what they truly were, imposters posing as patients, testing a system from the inside. The irony was that while doctors remained convinced, real patients often suspected something. "You're not crazy," one whispered. "You're a journalist or a professor." They were right. Rosenhan published the results in 1973. The impact was immediate. Psychiatry, he suggested, could not reliably distinguish between mental health and mental illness. The label itself could become a kind of trap once applied, hard to escape. A diagnosis could overshadow identity, transforming normal behavior into signs of disorder. The profession reacted with anger. Some accused Rosenhan of deception. One hospital challenged him to send more fake patients. Rosenhan agreed and sent no one. Over the following weeks, the hospital flagged dozens of new admissions as imposters. None were. The ghost they feared was themselves. The experiment helped spark reform. It pushed institutions toward deinstitutionalization, encouraged more humane treatment, and demanded clearer diagnostic standards. But beneath the statistics and headlines, a quieter truth remained that, in certain places, with certain words, the line between sanity and madness can vanish like breath on glass. In the end, the volunteers walked out, but others did not. Some are still waiting to be seen, not for their symptoms, but for their stories. And somewhere, a hospital corridor flickers under tired lights, where a person sits alone, writing in a notebook, wondering if anyone will ever believe they were sane to begin with. A teacher once asked a question that history had already answered, but his students needed to feel it to understand. In April of 1967, at a high school in Palo Alto, California, a young history teacher named Ron Jones faced a challenge. His students couldn't believe the stories of Nazi Germany. How could so many people go along with such horror? How could they follow so blindly? Words didn't seem enough. So, for 1 week, he created a living answer. He called it the third wave. On Monday, the lesson began with discipline. Jones instructed his students to sit straight, respond quickly, follow rules without question. They repeated slogans aloud. Strength through discipline. Some found it strange. Others found it thrilling. The air in the room shifted. Focus replaced boredom. Obedience became a kind of clarity. On Tuesday, the rules expanded into unity. A new slogan, strength through community. The students were given a secret salute, fingers together in a curved wave. They began to greet each other with it in the halls, eyes alight with purpose. They wore armbands. They whispered about the movement. And still, it grew. By midweek, the third wave had outgrown the classroom. Students from all over the school wanted in. Over 200 joined. They reported those who broke the rules. They turned in friends. Discipline became pride, and pride became power. By Thursday, Jones told them it wasn't just an experiment, it was a national movement. On Friday, he promised, their leader would speak. The auditorium would host a live broadcast of the figure behind it all. They gathered, full of energy, eager to see the face of something bigger than themselves. But when the screen came on, there was nothing, just static, just silence. Then, Ron Jones stepped forward. There was no leader, no movement. It had all been a mirror. And in that mirror, they had seen how easily loyalty can eclipse conscience, how quickly belonging can silence doubt. Some cried, others sat in stunned stillness. For 5 days, they had lived inside an idea, and that idea had reshaped them. The third wave experiment ended there, but its lessons rippled far beyond that room. It revealed how fast the seeds of control can grow, even in a free place. How ordinary people, with no bad intent, can surrender their freedom, not by force, but by invitation. It showed that sometimes, all it takes is the rhythm of marching feet and a name to whisper in unison for the self to disappear. And somewhere, beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights and folded desks, the echo remains, not in the rules they followed, but in how easily they forgot to ask why they were following at all. A quiet room, a chair, a voice of authority, and a switch that could deliver pain. In 1961, at Yale University, psychologist Stanley Milgram posed a question that had haunted history. How far will an ordinary person go when instructed to harm another by someone in charge? The question wasn't abstract. Just 16 years had passed since the end of World War II. Trials still echoed with the defense. I was only following orders. Milgram wondered whether obedience alone could unlock such darkness not in monsters, but in neighbors, in anyone. So, he built a setting that felt clinical, distant, controlled. Participants arrived believing they were part of a study on memory and learning. They were cast as the teacher. In the next room, hidden by a wall, was the learner, a stranger answering word, pair questions. With each mistake, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage each time. The shocks weren't real. The learner was an actor, but the teacher didn't know. As the dials turned from 30 volts upward, 150, 210, 300, the learner cried out, protested, eventually fell silent. A red label on the machine marked XXX, danger, severe shock. Still, the experimenter, dressed in a white lab coat, calmly urged the teacher to continue. Please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. Many did. Some hesitated, trembled, questioned, but most obeyed. A staggering number reached the maximum setting, pressing the switch even as their faces showed fear, doubt, and distress. They believed they had caused real suffering. Some left shaken, believing they may have killed a man. Milgram debriefed them afterward, assured them, but the weight lingered. It still does. The study revealed something unsettling, that obedience to authority can override personal conscience with terrifying ease, not in villains, but in ordinary people. That harm doesn't always arrive with malice. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard, with a gentle voice, with someone saying, "Trust me, it's part of the process." Milgram's experiment remains one of psychology's most debated moments. Ethically controversial, deeply influential. It showed that under the right pressure, the line between duty and morality blurs not because we want to cross it, but because we stop believing we're the ones making the choice. In the quiet laboratory, nothing screamed, but the silence carried a weight, like a curtain drawn between thought and action, where kindness becomes obedience, and the hand that hesitates still moves forward. And long after the switch is released, the question flickers on in the dark. How many followed, not because they believed, but because they didn't know they were allowed to stop? A basement became a prison, but the bars were made of suggestion. In the summer of 1971, at Stanford University, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to explore a question that had followed history through wars and regimes. What happens when ordinary people are placed into positions of power, stripped of it entirely? He recruited 24 healthy male college students. Randomly, they were assigned roles. Half would be guards, half would be prisoners. The setting was a mock prison, built in the basement of the psychology department. There were cells, uniforms, rules. Arrests were staged at participants' homes. Blindfolded, booked, and confined, the prisoners were led into a world that felt just real enough to forget it wasn't. At first, it was an experiment in role-play. Guards wore mirrored sunglasses and carried batons. Prisoners wore smocks and identification numbers. No physical violence was allowed. But by the second day, something had shifted. A hunger strike emerged. Solitary confinement followed. The guards became more controlling, more inventive in their punishments. Push-ups in the dark. Sleep deprivation. Mock counts whispered through the night. What was meant to run for 2 weeks was called off after 6 days. Some guards became cruel. Some prisoners collapsed. Zimbardo, playing the role of prison warden, became entangled in the illusion. It took the voice of a visiting graduate student, this future wife, to question what was happening. Her concern snapped the spell, and the experiment was shut down. What began as simulation had turned into something real. The Stanford Prison Experiment revealed the fragile line between identity and role. It wasn't about bad people. It was about how easily the self can disappear inside a uniform, behind sunglasses, under fluorescent light. The volunteers were not actors, but their actions changed with the costume. Power had transformed them, and those without power responded with confusion, despair, even obedience to mistreatment. It was not the dungeon that created the darkness. It was the permission to stop being oneself. Zimbardo's findings reshaped how we understand authority, confinement, and the psychology of control, but they also left a trail of ethical questions. The participants had consented to a study knot to suffering. Their distress was real, the lessons were deep, but the cost was high. And still, the image lingers, a quiet hallway under campus stairs, where voices rose and shadows grew longer, not because anyone was told to be cruel, but because no one was told they had to remain kind. Somewhere beneath the surface of every system, a mask waits and a question drifts quietly in the dark. What part of us do we trade away when we start to play the role too well? A child once reached for a soft white rat with wonder in his eyes, but wonder, it turned out, was something that could be unlearned. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, psychologist John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner sought to answer a simple question with unsettling depth. Could a child be taught to fear? Not through instinct, but by design. They believed emotions, even fear itself, could be conditioned like reflexes, shaped like clay. Their subject was a 9-month-old infant known only as Little Albert. He was calm, curious, unafraid of animals. When presented with a white laboratory rat, he smiled and reached out gently, fascinated. But Watson had something else in mind. In a quiet room, they began pairing the presence of the rat with a sudden, jarring clang, the striking of a steel bar behind Albert's head. The sound was sharp, unexpected, and deeply distressing. Again and again the rat appeared, and again the noise followed. Soon, Albert no longer smiled. The sight of the rat made him cry. His hands trembled. His gaze turned away. It didn't stop with the rat. The fear spread like a shadow. A rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask. Anything soft, white, and familiar now carried a quiet dread. In Watson's eyes, this was proof. Human emotion could be engineered, not born, but built. The experiment ended abruptly. Albert and his mother moved away before the fear could be unlearned. No reversal, no closure. What had been taught remained, and what remained followed. Later accounts suggest that the real Albert may have had health challenges. Some believe he died young, but even without that knowledge, the unease lingers. He was a child. And his fear was shaped, not by accident, but by intention. Watson's goal was science, to show that even emotion could be controlled, studied, replicated. But in doing so, he crossed a line, not with violence, but with quiet indifference. Albert's tears were not seen as suffering, but as data. His fear, not a wound, but a success. It taught the world something lasting, that the human mind, even in infancy, is tender and impressionable, that trust can be broken, not with harsh words, but with sudden sound. That fear, once planted, grows silently, and somewhere, in a long-forgotten corridor of a university lab, a ghost of a cry still echoes. Not loud, not angry, just unresolved, like a white rat in a child's memory, soft and harmless, now carrying the shape of something it was never meant to be. A quiet experiment once asked a devastating question. What happens when hope is removed, one shock at a time? In the late 1960s, at the University of Pennsylvania, psychologists Martin Seligman and Steve Mayer set out to study the roots of despair. Their focus was not the body, but the mind specifically, how it responds when every effort to escape suffering fails. They began with dogs. In the first phase, a dog was placed in a box with two sides, one safe, one wired to deliver a mild electric shock. A low barrier divided the two. When the shock came, the dog quickly learned to jump over the barrier to safety. The behavior was natural, logical, hopeful. But in the next phase, the same dog was restrained in a harness and subjected to unavoidable shocks. No escape, no control, just the sound of a buzzer and pain that could not be stopped. Over time, the dog stopped struggling. It simply waited. Later, they returned the dog to the original box. The barrier was still there. The safe side still existed. Nothing prevented escape. But something had changed. When the shock came, the dog did not move. It didn't even try. It lay down. It whimpered. It endured. The experiment had shown something haunting. The dog had learned helplessness. It had been taught not through words, but through experience that its actions didn't matter, that the world was unchangeable, that nothing it did would make a difference. It was a study in despair, and though the subject was an animal, the implications were deeply human. Seligman used these findings to explore the mechanisms of depression, the kind that emerges not from one moment of pain, but from the slow erosion of belief in one's own agency. The kind that whispers, "Why try?" when nothing changes. Ethically, the study would not be allowed today. The suffering, though quiet, was real, and yet the insight it gave was profound. It revealed that trauma isn't always loud or sharp. Sometimes it's the steady fading of effort, the soft collapse of the will to resist. And somewhere in that box, beneath the flicker of artificial light, a small body curled not in fear, but in surrender. The experiment ended. The dogs were unstrapped, but in some part of their minds, the walls still held. The pain had written something deeper than memory, a lesson too heavy to unlearn. And tonight, as the world quiets down and the mind drifts, one quiet question hums beneath the surface. Is it the cage that traps us, or the belief that we can no longer leave it? A quiet question once stirred the halls of medicine. Could the mind be healed by breaking the brain? In 1935, Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz believed so. He introduced a procedure meant to silence the storms of psychosis and depression. It was called the prefrontal lobotomy or leucotomy, a surgical incision into the soft folds of the frontal brain. Moniz believed that by cutting certain neural paths, the torment might ease. Not cure, perhaps, but calm. What began as cautious exploration soon became a movement. In the United States, a man named Walter Freeman would take the idea further and much colder. He refined it into a swifter act, the transorbital lobotomy. A slender instrument slipped beneath the eyelid and tapped into the skull. A flick of the wrist, a severing of thought. No need for surgical suites, no need for consent that reached true understanding. A procedure that took minutes, a change that lasted lifetimes. They called it revolutionary. Freeman toured the country in a van he named the Lobotomobile, performing hundreds. Some 60,000 Americans would be lobotomized in the 1940s and 50s. Patients with diagnoses ranging from deep psychosis to mild anxiety. Children, veterans, housewives. Some came out smiling. Others emerged, emptied. Nurses described them as quiet, compliant, peaceful. But families told different stories. A daughter, once vibrant, now stared through windows without blinking. A brother no longer wept, or laughed, or remembered what once made him feel alive. One mother whispered, "Her soul is gone, though she sits beside me." It was as if the surgery scooped out not just anguish, but essence. The lobotomy won Moniz a Nobel Prize, yet its legacy is haunted. What was offered as a cure left many adrift in a kind of waking sleep, not tormented, but no longer whole. The procedure faded slowly as antipsychotic medication rose, but the echoes remain. It asks us what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of silence, how easily suffering becomes inconvenience, and whether stillness in the mind is always a mercy or sometimes a forgetting. The prefrontal lobotomy did not disappear. It simply slipped into memory, like a ghost wandering the quiet halls of history, a reminder that healing, if forced too far, can blur into erasure. There is a line between calm and emptiness, and sometimes, in trying to mend what's broken, we unravel something that was never meant to be touched. A lesson once began not with a book, but with a question that lived in the silence after a tragedy. It was April 1968, the morning after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. In a quiet Iowa town, a third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott stood before her students, still grieving, still searching for something that might reach young hearts. In a world cracked open by hatred. What could make a child understand racism, not in theory, but in the marrow of a single school day? Elliot decided to show them, not tell. She looked into her classroom of white children and divided them by eye color. Blue eyes on one side, brown eyes on the other. She told the class that brown-eyed children were superior, smarter, kinder, more deserving. The blue-eyed were slower, less trustworthy, flawed. It wasn't true, but within moments, it was believed. Brown-eyed children were given longer recess, second helpings, soft praise. Blue-eyed ones were scolded, denied, reminded they were lesser. Collars were placed around their necks like quiet marks of shame. A wrinkle of biology became a chasm. The change was swift and startling. Children who had played together the day before now turned cold. Insults slipped easily between desks. Confidence vanished from some, swelled in others. Even the black teacher's aide noted the shift, that the superior children had become mean. Then, Elliot reversed the roles. Now blue eyes were best. And once again, children rose or crumbled depending on where they'd been placed. Not for what they'd done, but for what they were told they were. By the end of it, every child had lived both edges of the blade. Pride and shame, kindness and cruelty, born not from the heart, but from suggestion. The impact lingered long after the collars came off. Children cried. Some said they never wanted to feel that way again. Others, years later, would say it was the most powerful lesson they'd ever learned. But not all agreed it was just. Was it right to bruise a child's trust, even in the name of empathy? To mirror injustice so closely that it left a scar? Jane Elliott believed it was necessary. A mirror held up to innocence to reveal what prejudice could become. Her classroom became a living parable, where even the smallest hands learned how easily power corrupts, and how quickly we forget that all eyes dream the same way when closed. And maybe that is what stays, the haunting ease with which we learn to divide, and the fragile hope that we might also learn to stop. A question once whispered through the folds of the mind: can the feeling of the divine be summoned by science? In the late 20th century, in a quiet corner of Laurentian University in Canada, neuroscientist Michael Persinger built something strange. It was not a spiritual relic, nor a sacred symbol, just a snowmobile helmet wired with solenoids, designed to deliver soft, complex magnetic fields to the brain. He called it the God helmet. What he sought was not belief, but biology. Could mystical visions, ghostly presences, and even the voice of God be explained and reproduced through physics? Volunteers entered a small, silent chamber. They sat alone, helmets snug on their heads. No incense, no chanting, just a low hum of hidden energy brushing the temporal lobes. The magnetic signals mirrored the rhythms of the brain itself. Quiet waves designed not to overpower, but to awaken something subtle, and something did awaken. Many participants reported feeling a presence, not imagined, not metaphorical, but near. Some said it felt like someone was standing behind them. Others spoke of angels, lost loved ones, or a kind of vast awareness that hovered just beyond the visible, a silent companion in the dark. 80% of subjects felt it, a resonance beyond explanation. Persinger believed these sensations could reveal a truth, that the roots of spirituality were buried deep in the brain's own soil. If awe and reverence could be evoked with magnetism, Perhaps the sacred had a structure, a pattern encoded in our biology. Not everyone agreed. Critics questioned the methods, wondered about the power of suggestion, or whether silence and solitude alone could stir such feelings. The findings remain debated, but the stories linger. Real, emotional, human. Even philosopher Susan Blackmore, long a skeptic of the supernatural, called her God helmet experience the most extraordinary of her life. This experiment caused no pain, left no scars. But it asked a haunting question. What if the divine is not something we find, but something we create? It blurs the line between revelation and illusion, between what we believe and what we can be made to feel. And in that blurred space, a deeper mystery waits. At night, when the world is quiet, and something stirs just beyond perception, not quite seen, not quite known, one might ask, was it God? Was it memory? Or was it simply the brain, dreaming itself awake? A quiet mind may seem peaceful until peace turns into silence, and silence becomes something else entirely. In 1951, in a dim Montreal laboratory, psychologist Donald Hebb sought to understand the boundaries of the human mind. At the height of the Cold War, rumors of psychological manipulation and brainwashing were swirling. Hebb wanted to know, what happens to consciousness when the senses are stripped away? What remains when the world is turned off? Volunteers were recruited. Mostly university students offered a small stipend. Each agreed to spend time in a small, sealed chamber. They wore goggles that blocked sight, headphones that pumped in soft white noise, gloves to dull touch. No colors, no sounds, no clocks, no conversation, only a low hum and the rhythm of their own thoughts. It was called sensory deprivation, but it quickly became something else. As hours stretched into days, the mind began to unravel its own defenses. Subjects reported vivid hallucinations, geometric patterns blooming behind closed eyelids, phantom figures moving through the dark, and strange, internal narratives that no longer felt imaginary. One subject saw himself split in two versions of the same man, and for a moment, he couldn't tell which one was real. Time itself bent and blurred. Thoughts looped endlessly. Some begged to leave before the study ended. Hebb's team hadn't set out to torment, but to measure. Yet what they found was not just data, but something more fragile. A glimpse into how tightly our sense of self is held together by the quiet, constant rhythm of the world. When the experiment ended, there were no physical wounds, but many emerged, shaken, not broken, just changed. The study would go on to influence military training, intelligence tactics, and even the early designs for solitary confinement. It asked a profound and uncomfortable question. Are we ever truly ourselves in isolation? Or do we need the presence of others? Light, sound, touch. To remember who we are. Hebb's chambers were padded not with cruelty, but with curiosity. And yet, what they revealed was how easily the mind, left too long in its own echo, can begin to forget itself. There is a stillness so deep, it becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, you may find a stranger wearing your name. As sleep drifts closer, imagine a door slowly closing, not locked, just quiet, and behind it, a mind alone with its dreams, wondering gently which part of the silence still belongs to it. A child emerged from the woods, barefoot and silent, as if nature had raised him in secret. In the year 1800, in the rural forests of southern France, villagers discovered a feral boy. Naked, scarred, and unable to speak, he darted through trees more like an animal than a human. No one knew how long he had survived alone. He didn't seem to understand language. He didn't respond to his name, but his eyes held something, a quiet alertness, a searching. Scientists of the time saw a mystery worth unraveling. Was this child a blank slate, proof of what humans were before society? They called him Victor of Aveyron and delivered him to Paris, where physician Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard took responsibility for his care. Itard's goal was to civilize him, to draw out the human from within the wild. He believed language was the key. He used gestures and repetition, teaching Victor how to associate symbols with objects. He bribed with sweets, scolded with sternness. Every day was a drill: touch, point, repeat. For years, the effort continued. Victor learned some basic signs. He recognized a few words, but speech-full language never came. His progress plateaued. He remained between worlds, understanding but not expressing, aware but adrift. Itard's hopes dimmed, and the scientific community quietly moved on. Victor, however, stayed. He lived with caretakers into adulthood, quietly, never fully adapting, but never vanishing into the wild again. His presence lingered as something neither solved nor broken. A life not wasted, but not wholly reached. What Victor's story reveals is more than a scientific footnote. It is a meditation on what it means to be human. Can identity be given, or only grown? What is lost when early connection language, love, safety, never arrives? Itard believed he was unlocking potential, but in his rigid training, there was also distance. Victor was studied more than embraced. His silences were analyzed, but not always listened to. And yet, through it all, Victor remained gentle. He never lashed out, never sought escape. He accepted what came not with understanding, perhaps, but with endurance. Some say he was a child caught between two natures. Others say he was a mirror reflecting how much of humanity is learned, not born. And somewhere in the quiet, beneath the rustling leaves of an old forest path, there may still echo the soft steps of a boy who belonged to no language, only to the space between silence and sound, a child of no one, and yet a question left gently behind, for the world to keep asking. A bell rang in a quiet room, and somewhere a dog began to salivate, not from hunger, but from memory. In the early 1900s, in St. Petersburg, Russia, a physiologist named Ivan Pavlov sought to understand digestion. His goal was not psychology, not at first. He studied glands, secretions, reflexes, the mechanics of the body, not the mysteries of the mind. He used dogs as his subjects. Carefully, he implanted small devices to measure saliva. He fed them under strict conditions, noting every drop. Then, something unusual happened. The dogs began to salivate before the food appeared. They responded not to the meal itself, but to the footsteps that preceded it, the sound of a bowl, the presence of a white coat. Pavlov was curious, so he introduced a new signal, a bell. Each time food was offered, the bell rang, over and over. The repetition became routine. And eventually, the dogs no longer needed the food to respond. The bell alone made them salivate. It was a quiet revolution, a demonstration that reflexes, once thought purely biological, could be trained, conditioned. The dogs had not chosen this. They had been rewired, gently and precisely, to expect nourishment at a sound, to feel hunger at a cue. The experiment was scientific, clean, repeatable, but there was something eerie beneath the surface. These dogs, once free in their instincts, had become instruments of association. Their bodies had learned a rhythm that their minds could not refuse. What Pavlov uncovered shaped the foundation of behavioral psychology. He showed that learning could bypass thought entirely, that emotion, appetite, even fear could be reshaped with repetition and time. But the image stays, a dog, tethered in place, salivating to the chime of something that once meant nothing, a creature responding not to choice, but to a remembered signal. The bell became more than sound. It became prophecy. Today, the idea of conditioning lives far beyond the lab. It colors how we train, how we market, how we respond. In subtle ways, we all learn to react to signals we no longer notice. And somewhere in the still air of an old chamber, the bell may still echo, a soft reminder that behavior can be shaped like clay, even when the hands are invisible. Not all cages are made of walls. Some are built from sound and the quiet certainty that we'll respond, even when we no longer know why. A memory doesn't have to be real to feel true. Sometimes, the mind believes what it's gently told. In 2013, in a quiet lab bridging Cambridge and Tokyo, Dr. Susumu Tonegawa and his team explored the delicate boundaries between reality and recollection. Their goal was bold and futuristic, to see if they could plant a false memoryome that never happened, but would still be felt. The subjects were mice. In one part of the experiment, each animal was placed in a safe chamber, known as Box A. It was calm, familiar, no threat, no pain. As they explored, specific neurons in the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, fired and were marked. These were the cells encoding the sense of place, of peace. The researchers then tagged these cells with a light-sensitive protein using a technique called optogenetics. This meant the memory could be reactivated on demand using flashes of light. Later, in a different chamber, Box B, the scientists reactivated those exact memory cells while giving the mice a mild foot shock. The shock didn't happen in Box A, but the light made the brain believe it was back there. And something changed. When the mice were returned to Box A, they froze in fear. Their tiny bodies trembled. Their minds told them something had gone wrong there. A memory had been rewritten. A fear had been born from fiction. They were remembering pain that never occurred. The experiment was a landmark. It showed for the first time that a false memory could be implanted by directly manipulating brain activity. That fear could be made, not from experience, but from suggestion. The mice didn't know they'd been misled. Their behavior was honest, their emotion real, but the past they recalled had never happened. It was a quiet breakthrough, and an unsettling one, because if a mouse can be taught to fear a place it was never harmed, what does that say about the reliability of our own memories? How much of what we feel, the grief, the joy, the dread, is built not on truth, but on the stories our brains choose to tell? The findings held promise for treating trauma, perhaps even for reshaping painful memories, but they also whispered something softer, something stranger, that memory is not a photograph. It is a mirror made of breath. And somewhere, in a small dim chamber, a mouse stands still in a place it once felt safe, haunted by an echo that was never real. Proof that the mind can carry shadows, even when the light has always been kind. And in the silence that follows, a quiet question stirs. If memory can be made, what does it mean to truly remember?